The first thing I registered in the sterile white of the hospital room wasn't the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor or the dull ache in my side, but the unnerving lightness on my left hand before the surgery. My mother had insisted on holding onto my engagement ring, an $18,000 heirloom from my fiancé's family for safekeeping. She'd promised she'd protect it with her life, a promise that felt as hollow as the space on my finger. As I stared at my bare hand under the harsh fluorescent lights, a cold, familiar dread settled in my gut. I knew, with absolute certainty, that they had finally done it. They had sold my future to pay for my brother's. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Clara. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. The first thing I registered in the sterile white of the hospital room wasn't the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor or the dull ache in my side, but the unnerving lightness on my left hand before my surgery. My mother had insisted on holding onto my engagement ring, an $18,000 heirloom from my fiancé's family for safekeeping. She'd promised she would protect it with her life, a promise that felt as hollow as the space on my finger. As I stared at my bare hand under the harsh fluorescent lights, a cold, familiar dread settled in my gut. I knew, with absolute certainty, that they had finally done it. They had sold my future to pay for my brother's. The discharge nurse called out a cheerful, "Who's picking you up, hun?" And I answered, "My parents," because at that moment it was still supposed to be true. An hour later, dressed in clothes that felt too loose on my weakened frame, I sat in the waiting area as my phone buzzed with a text. "Something came up with Derek. Just grab a rideshare, we'll reimburse you." No apology, no explanation, just a blunt dismissal, as if I were a minor inconvenience in the grand drama of my brother's life. So that's how I went home from a major surgery. Slumped in the back of a stranger's sedan, the plastic hospital bracelet still cutting into my wrist while the driver chattered about traffic patterns. My fiancé, Ben, wasn't there, but that was by my own design. He'd wanted to cancel a crucial site visit for his architecture firm, a trip he'd been planning for months, but I'd insisted he go. My parents had sworn up and down they would be there for me, that they would handle everything. I had let myself believe, for a fleeting, foolish moment, that I could trust them with this one simple task. When I finally walked into our quiet apartment, the first thing I did was head to my workroom. I bypassed the bed, the need for rest completely overshadowed by the cold, hard need for confirmation. My mistrust wasn't paranoia. It was a survival skill honed over 30 years before the surgery. I had taken the museum-quality replica of my ring, a perfect copy I'd commissioned for insurance purposes, and placed it into the elegant blue box. What I hadn't anticipated was the depth of their resolve. I opened my antique appraisal toolkit where I had hidden the real ring. Nestled beneath a velvet lining, the space was empty. They hadn't just taken the bait I'd left for them. They had used the emergency key I'd given them for my apartment, entered my private space while I lay vulnerable in a hospital bed, and hunted for the real prize, the violation of it all. The premeditated theft felt like a physical blow. I didn't even bother to call. I drove straight to their house, my movements stiff and controlled. Mom opened the door before my knuckles could touch the wood, a bright, brittle smile on her face. "Clara, we were just talking about you," she chirped, as if my sudden appearance was a delightful surprise. My father was in his usual recliner, the television murmuring in the background. He gave me a brief nod, his eyes flicking from me to my mother in that silent, shared language I'd spent a lifetime trying to decode. "I came for my ring," I said, my voice flat, leaving no room for pleasantries. Their smiles didn't falter, but something shifted in their eyes. The air grew tight. My mother glanced at my father, a flicker of confirmation passing between them. "Well, about that," she began, her tone oozing a practiced sort of patience. "Thanks to your little nest egg, your brother is finally getting the break he deserves. He's on his way to securing our family's future." I stared at her, the words not quite forming a coherent thought. My father leaned forward, switching off the television with the remote. "We sold it, Clara," he said, as if discussing a trivial stock transaction. "Don't look so horrified. It was just an object sitting in a box. Derek needed the capital for his new cryptocurrency venture. This is big." I could feel the blood draining from my face. "You entered my home. You stole my engagement ring, Ben's family heirloom." My mother waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be so sentimental. And stole is such an ugly word. We simply reallocated a family resource. Besides, Derek's partner in this venture is a very important man, and Derek needed to show he was serious. You can't put a price on an opportunity like that." I gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady myself, my knuckles turning white. The buzzing in my ears was so loud I could barely hear my own voice. "You didn't even ask me." Her smile tightened into a thin line. "You would have just said no. You've always been resistant to helping your brother achieve his potential." A laugh escaped my throat before I could stop it, a harsh, humorless sound that startled even me. Their confident expressions faltered for the first time. "What's so funny?" my mother demanded, her voice sharp. I looked from her perfectly composed face to my father's stoic one, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of fear behind their arrogance. I let a small, cold smile touch my lips. "The ring you sold was a fake," I said softly, letting the words hang in the air. "But don't worry, you'll find out all about the real one soon enough." I didn't explain, I didn't scream. I just turned and walked out, leaving them in a stunned silence that was louder than any argument I could have started. I didn't drive straight home. I pulled over to the curb at the end of their street, cutting the engine and the headlights, and just sat there in the suffocating darkness of the car. The rage I expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, there was a profound and terrifying stillness, the kind that comes after something inside you has irrevocably snapped. This wasn't a new betrayal. It was just the final one. It was the culmination of a lifetime of being the second choice, the afterthought, the resource to be tapped for the sake of the golden boy, Derek. He was 2 years older, and in our house. That might as well have been a different lifetime. When he wanted a new computer for his gaming career, they found the money. When I needed a new laptop for my university courses in art history, I was told to get a part-time job because it would build character. His birthdays were catered events with dozens of friends. Mine were a sheet cake in the kitchen with a quiet happy birthday and a gift card. Every time I dared to point out the disparity, I was met with the same gaslighting phrases: "You're being too sensitive," or "Don't be so dramatic, Clara." So I stopped pointing it out. I learned to build my own life, to find my worth in my career as an appraiser, where my eye for detail and value was celebrated. And then I met Ben. He was the first person who saw me not as what I could provide, but as who I was. He listened. He showed up. He made me feel like I was more than enough when he proposed with his great-grandmother's ring. My first reaction wasn't joy, but a pang of guilt. "It's too much," I'd whispered. He had simply taken my hand and said, "You deserve a legacy of your own." That ring wasn't just a diamond. It was proof. It was proof that the narrative my parents had written for me, the one where I was the supporting character in my own life, was a lie. And they had taken that proof, that symbol of a love I had never thought I'd find, and liquidated it for a get-rich-quick scheme. As I sat there in the car, I realized they had handed me all the power I would ever need. They just didn't know it yet. The first crack in their smug facade appeared 3 days later. My phone began to buzz incessantly around midnight. lighting up the bedroom. A dozen missed calls from my mother, 5 from my father. I finally answered on the 13th call, a weary sigh escaping my lips. Clara! My mother's voice was a strange shriek. What did you do? I sat up, the sleepiness vanishing instantly. Good evening to you, too. Mom. Don't you play games with me? She snapped. Mister, Harrison Derrick's investor, he took the ring to be appraised for his wife. They told him it was a worthless piece of glass. So, the appraisal had landed. I could hear my father roaring in the background. Is Ben's ring a fake? Did that man trick you? I pinched the bridge of my nose, a headache beginning to form. No, the real ring is perfectly fine. It's safe with me. A beat of confused silence. Then what is this? My mother demanded, her voice trembling with rage. What did you sell? How could you humiliate your brother like this? Humiliate them? The choice of words was so perfectly narcissistic, it was almost beautiful. I didn't sell anything, I said, my voice calm and even. You sold a replica. A very convincing one, I admit, but a fake nonetheless. What you did with it after that is entirely on you. The line went silent for a moment. And then the accusations began. You set us up. Why would you do this to your own family? My mother cried. Set you up? I let out a dry laugh. You're the ones who stole a family heirloom and sold it without a second thought. That's theft. Family doesn't give you a free pass for committing a crime. My father got on the phone, his voice a low growl. This isn't a joke, Clara. Do you have any idea the mess you've made, mister? Harrison is furious. He thinks we're con artists. He's threatening to pull out of Derrick's deal and tell everyone. I couldn't help the small smile that touched my lips. Oh, I have a very good idea, I said softly. The real question is, do you... Then came the begging, predictable as the sunrise. You have to help us, Mom pleaded. This is serious. He wants his money back. All of it. Now. That sounds like your problem, not mine, I replied. But we don't have it, she shrieked. We already gave it to Derrick, and he invested it. We can't get it back. He needed this, Clara. And there it was again. The eternal justification, Derrick, the sun around which their entire world revolved. He's your brother, she said, as if that was a magical incantation that could erase everything. I closed my eyes. And I'm your daughter, I whispered. Funny how that never seems to count for anything. I hung up the phone and turned it to silent, letting the darkness of the room swallow their panic. They showed up at my apartment 2 days later. I knew it was them from the frantic, demanding rhythm of the knock on the door. When I opened it, my mother's face was pale and drawn, my father's jaw was tight with fury, and Derrick stood behind them, looking less like a budding entrepreneur and more like a cornered animal. We need to talk, my father said, trying to push his way inside. I held my ground, leaning against the doorframe. We are talking, I said calmly. My mother's composure broke. Clara, please, mister. Harrison is going to ruin us. He's telling everyone that the Millers are fraudsters. Derrick's reputation will be destroyed before he even begins. Derrick finally spoke, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and desperation. This is all your fault. If you had just given us the real ring, none of this would have happened. You have to fix this. You owe us. I stared at him, truly seeing the depth of his entitlement for the first time. He genuinely believed he was the victim. I owe you nothing, I said, my voice as cold and hard as a diamond. That ring was a symbol of love and history and trust. You sold it to chase a digital fantasy. You made your choice. The consequences are yours to live with. I started to close the door. My mother put her hand out to stop it. We're your family, she cried, her eyes wide with disbelief. I looked at her hand on my door, then back at her face. That hasn't meant what you think it means for a very long time. I closed the door, engaged the deadbolt, and walked away as they continued to shout my name from the hallway. The fallout was quiet but devastating. I didn't have to do anything. I just watched from a distance as their world unraveled. A friend sent me a link to a post on a local business forum, a warning from Mr. Harrison about the unethical practices of a young man named Derek Miller. The crypto venture was dead before it ever began. An aunt called me, her voice dripping with pity that was thinly disguised as judgment, telling me my parents had to take out a high-interest second mortgage on their house to pay back the money. Their credit was ruined. A few months later, a cousin sent me a screenshot of a real estate listing. It was my childhood home. They were forced to sell, to downsize into a cramped rental apartment on the other side of town, away from the community where they had spent decades building a reputation that was now in tatters. They tried to spin the story, of course, in the family group chat. My mother posted about embracing a simpler lifestyle and downsizing for retirement. But the whispers told the real story. And me, I walked down the aisle on a perfect autumn day, my hand steady in my father-in-law's arm. Ben was waiting for me, his eyes filled with a love that was unconditional and true. The real ring, his great-grandmother's ring, sparkled on my finger, a testament to a legacy I was now a part of. My parents and Derek were not there. I had not invited them. For the first time in my life, at a major family event, I didn't feel like I was missing a thing. A year after the wedding, we were expecting our first child. My life was full of joy and anticipation, of building a future with Ben. The messages from my parents started again, first syrupy and sweet, then pleading, then demanding. They wanted to be grandparents. They insisted the baby deserved to know its family. Relatives were enlisted to call and text, to tell me I was being cruel, that I was holding a grudge, that my parents had suffered enough. One evening, exhausted and fed up, I finally responded, not to them, but to the family group chat where the whispers had been circulating. I wrote out the entire truth, calmly and factually. How they had stolen and sold the heirloom ring from my home while I was in the hospital. How they had been caught trying to pass off a fake. How their financial ruin wasn't my fault, but the direct result of their own greed and desperation. I pressed send, and then I blocked every single one of them. The silence that followed was eventually replaced by a flood of private messages from cousins and aunts, filled with shock and apology. The tide of family opinion had turned. The last I heard, Derek had moved back in with my parents in their small rental apartment, the three of them trapped together in the wreckage of their own making. A few weeks ago, a thick letter arrived with my mother's handwriting on it. I recognized the scrawl of blame and self-pity from a mile away. I didn't open it. I simply placed it on the end table in our new nursery and set my glass of water down on it, the condensation forming a small, satisfying ring on the paper. I hadn't lost anything except a weight I had been carrying my entire life. And for the first time, that felt like a fair trade.